Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I'm deeply pleased and moved. And first of all, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for coming to the event and hopefully taking part in the conversation that we will have after my talk. I want also to express my gratitude to the various institutions who are sponsoring tonight's event. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. First, the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, whose director is my very, very dear friend Petar Bojanic, and where I also have many other friends. Then the Cultural Center of Belgrade, offering us this superb venue for tonight's lecture, and the interpreter who is listening to me right now. The paper that I'm going to read, I hope it's not too boring. I cannot swear in advance, we'll see. Anyway, it's a paper that I hope can give you an idea of the kind of issue I'm working on. I've been working on in the past years, always trying, as Petar wonderfully suggested, to combine political or more generally social and civic concerns with philosophical reflections, which, of course, over the years, many years since reading Capital, have been shifting, moving from one language to another. But I believe essentially remained associated, I would say, or linked to a critical perspective in philosophy. So this combination is always there in what I'm trying to do, also when I teach classes. But of course the accent, depending on the circumstances or the subject that I'm addressing, the accent is more directly on the political circumstances and consequences, or it's more on the conceptual and philosophical side. And tonight it will be this philosophical aspect or this philosophical dimension that I will particularly try to illustrate. To finish with these preliminaries, which I hope are not a way of excusing myself, I will simply say that this is an English text that I wrote some months ago, after I had been teaching a seminar on this issue, civic universalism and its internal exclusions, the issue of anthropological difference in various English-speaking universities, especially the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Irvine in California. And I was trying at the time to write a final version for the concluding chapter of this big collection of this thick, very thick collection of essays that Petar just mentioned. It's come out, it's been published now in France with the title I translate into English, Citizen Subject and Other Essays in Philosophical Anthropology. The starting point, I'm trying not to bother you too much with these details, but maybe it's interesting to know that the starting point or the introductory essay is a piece that I wrote really very, very long ago. That was in 1989, when a good friend and colleague of ours, who's now also become a very famous French philosopher. You didn't mention his name because he was not part of the group around Althusser. He was rather, he's widely known as being one of Derrida's closest friends and collaborators. Jean-Luc Nancy had proposed to a number of French philosophers from various generations, so very prestigious names such as Deleuze, Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, and more junior people like me and others, to answer a very strange question. The question was, who comes after the subject? The book was published, it's a collected book, it was published in French as a special issue of a psychoanalytic journal, but it was especially published in English with this title, and it's still, I believe, relatively easy to find in English. So that was a very strange question, of course, prompted by the whole series of debates in the 60s and 70s, with contributions from many different streams or currents in contemporary philosophy, post-Heideggerian deconstruction and phenomenology, structuralism, of course, Nietzschean philosophy, etc., which together, in a sense, I mean, they had many disagreements, but they converged in questioning the traditional notion of the subject, or the transcendental subject, the constitutive subject, as it had been inherited from a long tradition, from Descartes, from Kant, from Husserl, and had become something like a sacred, if you like, a category in modern philosophy. So contrary to what has been written sometimes, the intention of all those philosophers, I repeat, structuralists, Heideggerians, or Nietzscheans, who criticized the notion of the founding or constitutive subject, was not to dismiss the category of the subject or to defend the idea, to support the idea that there was no subject, if you like, either a subject, thinking subject, or an acting and practical subject. But it was to criticize the metaphysical dimensions, I would say, of this category, and to unravel its ideological functions. So Jean-Luc Nancy wanted to, and this discussion was also very, very profoundly intertwined and combined with a critique of humanism. It's very widely known and recalled as the humanist controversy, opposing humanists and anti-humanists. And at the time, of course, the group around Althusser was perceived as very typical representative of the anti-humanist tendency, which, in parentheses, put us at odds with many currents of critical Marxists in Europe, particularly in Yugoslavia, what at the time was still Yugoslavia, the Praxis group, with whom we had many interests, but who, I would say, globally speaking, roughly speaking, stood on the opposite side in that controversy. So the conviction that was also permeating, or that was prevalent in that discussion was very much that the issue of humanism and the issue of anthropology, social anthropology, cultural anthropology, philosophical anthropology in the end form, so to speak, one single complex of problems. So that, for example, if I return to Althusser and his group, the group around him, because he considered that it was very important in philosophy to carry on a theoretical critique of the traditional metaphysical and juridical notion of the constitutive subject, and because also from that reason he, together with Foucault, you know, remember Foucault's very famous phrase, provocative phrase at the end of the book The Order of Things, that was published in 1966, prophesizing that the idea of man would, in the end, dissolve as a philosophical idea. So all these people, with nuances, I have to say, shared the idea that philosophy should not become identified with anthropology, that its main orientation and goal was to study relations, to study structures, to study conditions under which the human condition is changing from one time to another, or from one social structure to another, but certainly not keep on the tracks of the traditional program of a philosophical anthropology. Now, what I'm going to present to you tonight, and now I will start reading the text, might seem to be completely contradicting this starting point, as if I had pure and simply reversed my positions. This, of course, happens quite normally. You work for 50 years. I started very young, as you recall, as a student of Althusser and Derrida and the others. And after all, it could be very well the case that at the end I uncovered that I had been completely wrong, and we had been completely wrong, and we should take the opposite stance. I believe that it's not just as simple as that. What took place in fact, and I tried to explain that in the foreword to my recent book, is that are two things, and after that I come to the text. One, the controversy over humanism progressively withered away or became a secondary controversy, and another controversy came to the fore, became prevalent, both politically and philosophically. Of course, nothing that was totally unpredictable. It was the controversy about universalism, for a number of reasons, linked to the post-colonial debate, linked to the great transformations that are taking place in the world today, and the kind of conflicts, in fact, and difficulties that arise when, to use the words of my very dear friend and colleague Judith Butler, conflicting universalities become part of the same conversation. And with that shift of emphasis, I think that the kind of confusion between the two issues of universalism, of humanism and anthropology, which we had been adopting and sharing at the time, started to dissolve. So what in fact I'm trying to defend tonight in this text, for example, and others that I've been writing more recently, is a strange and perhaps paradoxical kind of philosophical attitude which takes very seriously, tries to take very seriously the program or the project of philosophical anthropology, but remains essentially anti-humanist, not in the sense, of course, of being opposed to human beings or opposing sympathy, I would say, to the humans that we are and who are around us, but in the sense of precisely not accepting a metaphysical notion of man as a starting point in philosophy. Perhaps this is a little abstract, but when if we have time for that in the conversation, and if you are interested, of course, we can try to clarify that. Okay, so now I'm going to read the text. The initial idea of this lecture is that modernity has brought about a transformation both in the representation of the universal and the understanding of subjectivity and subject formation, which strictly combines the political and metaphysical aspects of these two notions. I call the new figure, the new modern figure of universality, civic universality, or even better, civic bourgeois universality, by using as a subtext the full range of meanings involved traditionally in the name Bürger in German, which means citoyen and bourgeois in French. And I suggest that its main character, which precisely accounts for the universality that it performatively enunciates, especially in such emblematic texts as the Declaration of Rights, is a rigorous adequacy between the capacities of the human and the powers of the citizen. Excuse me, parenthesis, this is for the interpreter. Is this a good rhythm for you? What does she say?
Yes.
Okay, good. This means first that every human is entitled to accessing citizenship. And conversely, the rights of the citizen indicate capacities which are deemed to express the powers and requisites of human nature in general. Let us observe here that this entails a revolution in the representation of the subject, which annihilates the figures of its subjection to various pre-established authorities, legal and extra-legal, immanent and transcendent, picturing them as so many forms of inequality and servitude built in the individuals belonging to communities and social relations. But the story cannot end with these great emancipatory gestures. It must also include a new process, a new regime of the becoming subject of the citizen, or, if you like, his subjectivation, which are intimately linked with the realization of the universal within institutions in the form of processes of socialization, conferring upon the subject its capacities to relate to others in performing universal actions. Again, this for the interpreter, I hope you follow me. I need to make a quick parenthesis here. In fact, I have to confess I have absolutely no idea of how you translate the term subject into Serb. The fact is that in this text and others, I'm continuously taking advantage of the fact that in some European languages, particularly French, but also English, of course, French and English, the term subject and the name subjection have the same roots, you see. So you can speak of a free subject, as in Kant or even in Descartes, or the subject of thought or the subject of actions. This is the metaphysical category. But then you can say that an individual, or perhaps a group or a community, is subjected to the authority and power of this or that instance. And my claim, or my starting point, is the idea that this sort of play on words, you know, is not haphazard, and that it's very profoundly rooted in the history of all philosophical and also, of course, juridical, political, and metaphysical and theological debates about subjection, subjecthood, subjectivation. But that is not the case in every language. For example, it's not the case in German, of course. Although, of course, German philosophers like Kant perfectly knew the two meanings of the term in Latin, for example, which they spoke quite normally. But in German, they had two different terms. Subjekt, to express the metaphysical notion or the grammatical notion, and Untertan, to express the notion of the political subject or the idea of subjection to an authority. And I don't know how it works in Serb, in fact, but the fact is that much of this text makes use of this play on words and of the parenthesis. So I skip to the beginning of the next paragraph. But then we may observe that where the claim of the universal is equality and liberty, plus other subsequent values, the reality of the civic bourgeois world is more than ever, and perhaps more than before, in some sensitive areas, that of discriminations and hierarchies. Subjectivation keeps involving subjection, albeit in different forms and in different spaces. I submit that such a contradiction is not to be considered only as a gap between the ideal and the real, but as arising from the universal itself, or affecting its concept from the inside. Because old and new forms of discrimination and oppression have to be reformulated in the bourgeois civic world in order to emerge as implications of the universal itself or as requisites of its very institution. This means that they have to be located at the level of what I would call anthropological differences. That is, differences perceptible among the humans that are also immediately constitutive of the idea of the human. And this involves an extreme violence, latent or manifest, because it means that the only consistent way to deny citizenship to individuals in a regime of civic bourgeois universality is to deny them full humanness, full membership in the human species. It becomes thus necessary to invent concepts and representations of the human which will imply more or less radical exclusions from the political membership, and to express these exclusions in terms of the very universality of the human differences, such as the difference of the masculine and the feminine, the normal and the pathological, the adult and the infantile, the intellectual and the manual, the ethnic differences, etc. I also suggest that this typical antinomy, accounts, at least formally, for a double bind which claims of rights are exposed to in the bourgeois civic world, namely the necessity of reclaiming the universal and the antithetic necessity of opposing the universal, looking critically into its definition, to identify the roots of certain forms of oppression and subjection, or at least the roots of their legitimation. From this general statement of purposes, I want now to proceed to the examination of some typical forms of the construction of the anthropological difference within the realm of civic bourgeois universalism. First case, first example, for which I chose the title borrowed from Hobbes, Who Shall Be Judge? The first difference that I will examine, borrowing from a series of analyses carried on by Michel Foucault in the early and mid-70s, concerns processes of definition of normality through a simultaneous negation of its opposites, mental pathologies and criminal behaviors in particular. In his lectures at the Collège de France from 1974-75, Abnormals, Les Anormaux, as well as a subsequent lecture from 1978 called The Dangerous Individual, he would, thank you, Peter, he would study technologies of power which articulate a new field of scientific knowledge with the governmentality of the emerging industrial society. Indeed, these technologies never entirely eliminate open violence, but they mainly rely on disciplines which do not so much state interdictions or try to terrorize the subjects, then they try to select, prescribe, and shape the individual's conducts. This is a strategy which involves setting up models of normality, but also having them accepted and recognized by the subject. Historically, it will become the objective of typically modern institutions such as scientific medicine and the penal system, but also the school or the school system, in short, all the great apparatuses or equipments of bourgeois society. All these institutions operate through the broad antithesis of normality and abnormality. They formulate discriminations or judgments which distinguish among individuals, classify them socially, but also morally, distinguishing different modalities of contradicting the norm. To the age-old question, always closely associated to the category of sovereignty, quis judicabit, or who shall be judge, they now give the democratic answer. Judge shall be who is normal, or it is the normal majority, either directly or through its capable representatives, who in turn, through their ruling, ascertain the normalcy of the majority. However, this is where things become more complicated, and the notion of normality, logically constituted as a negation of its own negation, proves terribly ambiguous. This is not only because normality can become negated in different ways and to different degrees. Mental pathologies are divided into idiocy, neuroses, perversions, psychoses, etc. And criminal law distinguishes different crimes or felonies in order to adapt their punishments. Rather, what will destabilize the norm while practically enforcing it is the fact that incompatible abnormalities are inscribed in a continuity and may even ultimately become fused. This is a long story, ending with the institutional alliance of psychiatry and criminal law, which produces a paradoxical merging of the mad and the criminal as social and psychological types. What especially interested Foucault was a convergence of two correlative processes taking place in the early 19th century and continuing well into the 20th century. I should not do that because it will make the talk longer, but I open a quick parenthesis here. It's very important to remember that Foucault's lectures in 74-75 were very close in time, were directly associated with the revelation that the Soviet regime was using psychiatric institutions to repress political opponents deemed criminals in the totalitarian ideology. On one side, we can follow a developing competition between judges and doctors. At stake here is the power struggle between two corporations or faculties to decide which of them must control the survey and isolation of great criminals who committed atrocious acts such as parricides and infanticides, which evoke the specter of madness and monstrosity. Eventually, the struggle leads to a tight collaboration of the two faculties in the framework of the penal procedure. The psychiatrist becomes a judiciary expert whose scientific knowledge is necessary both to decide which criminals can be brought to court and whether they can be punished. The expert, in a sense, is now a judge judging before the judge, who provides a pre-judgment. Foucault would show that this cooperation is crucial to transform the crime from a simple objective breaking of the law and an assault on the authority of the sovereign into the expression of a deviant personality, therefore installing before the crime and as its source a psychological and social figure, the criminal, defined as a subject capable of crime, of committing crimes, because he or she harbors criminal instincts or impulses. On the correlative side of the theory or the scientific disciplines, we observe the invention and the epistemological foundation of new negative categories, particularly that of perversion and perversity, extracted from moral discourse to become the other negative side of normality that permanently threatens it and could overthrow it. The notion of the perverse individual increasingly substitutes old notions of monstrosity, dementia, and monomania, and it leads to a typology of dangerous individuals, dangerous both for society and for themselves, which calls for an institutional system of defenses. On such basis, it becomes thus possible to envisage a continuity of criminality and pathology. A psychological science transformed into an auxiliary of police and justice will seek the causes of pathologies and disorders, particularly sexual, which lead to commit crimes and should be traceable to the childhood of the subjects. Hence, the importance of establishing a preventive discipline within the family, whose typical example was the rigid interdiction of infantile masturbation. Finally, in what Foucault calls a process of meta-somatization, it becomes the function of a speculative biology to relate these perversions to processes of degeneracy of the species, which call for biopolitical defenses, both medical and racial, eugenic and pedagogic. The notion of a danger for the species indicates that what is at stake is a return of the inhuman into the human, or the construction of something like a human figure of the inhuman. If it can become an obsession, this is also because a question is crystallized here which personally concerns the subject as a citizen, particularly when the citizen is also potentially a juror in the democratic institution of the tribunal. For Foucault, the modern criminal trial is a kind of truth procedure where the citizens forming the sovereign people not only defend their security, but also try to understand who they are, what they are capable of doing. In other terms, how fragile are the barriers which sometimes protect us from criminal pathology, sometimes don't. It seems to me that this confers also a reflexive function upon the anthropological difference seen as a deviation from normality, which typically bars access to property, responsibility, and citizenship for certain individuals. It belongs to a sort of collective or institutional introspection, always receiving indeed too many simultaneous answers for each of them to be really convincing. I may be permitted here to refer to an essay that I had published in 1990 on the occasion of interdisciplinary debates provoked by a draft reform of the 1810 French Penal Code and the subsequent law dated 1838, which still, at the time, governed the irresponsibility of mad criminals and their subjection to administrative rules of mandatory confinement in lunatic asylums. I was already using those of Foucault's texts available at the time, and I reflected on discursive strategies of bourgeois politics for making penal responsibility and social deviancy intelligible, not only in order to protect the society, but also to inculcate norms to the social subjects. I attached these strategies to the three typical ideologies of political ideologies of modernity by using a simple logical typology. To the strategies of liberal politics, I attached the idea that a subject can be either mad or criminal, but certainly not both, thus a logical disjunction. To the strategies of conservative politics, I attached the idea that a subject can be both mad and criminal, thus a logical conjunction which is periodically reactivated by discourses of social defense invoking biological and sociological determinisms. Finally, to the strategies of a utopian politics, which can be either anarchist or socialist, I attached the idea that dangerous subjects are ultimately neither mad nor criminal, thus a logical simultaneous rejection, because deviancy results ultimately from pathogenic and criminogenic social conditions. They would evade the alternative of the normal and the pathological, or rather, it would be society itself which can be measured according to this distinction and which becomes as it were, dangerous for itself. Intellectually, of course, it is the liberal position, pivotal in the system, which is the most fragile and the most ambivalent. To stretch apart the mad and the criminal is to open the possibility of a collective discrimination which seems essential for a democratic order, whose participants are both fallible and autonomous, meaning that, as much as possible, they must protect their own normality rather than having it imposed by discretionary institutions. But it also means that normality works inside the liberal society as an instrument of exclusion, to provide the subjects with the conviction that they are not abnormal, or they recognizably differ from those others who are designated as abnormal by some stigma. This, it seems to me, dovetails with the implicit lesson drawn by Foucault. Power knowledge instituted by justice and psychiatry brings about a fundamental uncertainty with respect to the exact nature of the danger threatening the subject's autonomy. We could also present it as a double bind affecting anthropological differences in general. They are not only impossible to dismiss, which means that it is absurd to imagine humans outside of such differences. They are also impossible to define or locate in a univocal manner, in the form of lines of demarcation simply separating classes or groups of humans who are essentially heterogeneous or possess different characters. In this case, what remains forever problematic is to absolutely define what distinguishes a normal or healthy subject from a subject who is mentally ill, or an honest subject from a delinquent or a criminal. A fortiori, it is impossible to simply distribute abnormals between the categories of madness and criminality, which could explain why a liberal politics in this matter retains a utopian character and remains permanently subject to the pressure of a notion of a society to be defended and to collective obsessions of perversity looming below its appearances of civility. Having sketched this first model, I can embark on other analyses and discussions concerning in particular the ethnic difference and the sexual difference. My idea is to examine, very superficially of course, very quickly, whether analogous patterns of inevitability and indefinition or essential indeterminacy can be found here, and in which terms they should be expressed. It is also to examine how anthropological differences overlap, how they presuppose each other, which means that they are never reducible to a single and a simple model. Each of them has a specific history, but these histories concur in setting the horizon of the inhuman human in the framework of civic bourgeois universality. The ethnic difference was often projected into the non-European realm as an object of ethnographic scholarly study and administrative colonial management. But it also aimed at reflecting the indigenous foundations of domestic Western communities. It has an essential link to the institution of the nation, itself a crystallization of the universal and its restriction. therefore, to the constitution of the citizen as a national subject. This subject is not so much the result of processes of normalization, albeit they are still there, even in a subordinated function, than of processes of identification. I use this distinction between processes of normalization and processes of identification to try and theoretically organize the subject formation in what I call civic bourgeois universality. Marks of belonging to a given national community or people are retrieved in the individual and again interiorized by him or her as conditions of living together, sharing the burdens and enjoying the benefits of speaking a certain common language, belonging to a certain tradition with its symbolic and imaginary references, accepting the duties and sacrifices that it requests, etc. It is clearly the case that the objective and subjective dimensions of identity formation and identity reproduction are involved in the anthropological representation of humankind as a single species, which nevertheless consists of a diversity of ethnic communities. But what particularly interests me here is also the counter effect of such a representation, namely the emergence of the figure of the stranger as other. And above all, it is the return of the stranger from within in the figure of an intruder, out of place as it were, this internal other who is both inevitable and subject to the ambivalent effects of repulsion and fascination. What strikes me here is a dramatic indeterminacy of the languages of race and culture. Leaving aside all the necessary and careful discussions of their definitions, I would submit that a genealogy of these categories used to identify the external and, above all, the internal other shows that the racial and the cultural could never become absolutely separated, inasmuch as they command precisely affiliations, or memberships, if you prefer. As post-colonial theorists particularly have shown, a cultural element was always involved in the alleged biological classification of races, inasmuch particularly as it was indiscernible from a representation of hierarchies, relationships of inferiority and superiority among so-called pure and hybrid races, based on the antithesis of barbarity and civilization. But conversely, a racial element was also and remains, I believe, even today, involved in the classification of cultures, in all the debates about culturalism and multiculturalism, at least in a metaphoric sense, or to follow the indications offered by Paul Gilroy in the substitution of the color line by the culture lines. Over the years, I tried to investigate the symbolic structure of this racial element and the reasons for its permanent reiteration through the tentative definition of what, after Derrida, I called a genealogical scheme, which is dominant in our discourses as soon as a heritage or a transmission of properties from one generation to another generation and over the succession of generations is invoked to account for the reproduction of our identities, our collective identities. The genealogical scheme is at stake in the semantic derivations and displacements, from descent to degeneracy, from ancestry to genetics, from inheritance to heredity, from translation to tradition, etc. Clearly, it is profoundly destabilized by the contemporary phenomena of transnationalization, but it appears also as a recourse against what is perceived as a threat to collective identities and individual rootedness produced by globalization, a threat produced by globalization. However, I maintain that in their very substitutability, and in spite of the fact that both of them involve attention of the universal and the particular, the categories of race and culture remain profoundly disymmetric. Drawing inspiration in particular from Frantz Fanon's incisive and tragic essay, Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952, I submit that there is a residue of unexchangeable difference, which is in particular the empirical body, or the inscription of identities in the materiality and the plasticity of a bodily object of desire and repulsion, both highly sexualized and accompanied by various ways of instituting the distinction of the somatic and the spiritual. For instance, the color, which for that reason forms a last refuge for the inexplicability of the human. It also provides, as we know, powerful resources for the performative reversals of the name race, which combine a political and an aesthetic dimension. It is around the spectral character of this body, at the same time highly visual and made invisible, that Fanon had organized his phenomenology of internal exclusion of the racial other, particularly the ex-slave, but also his analysis of colonial and post-colonial double consciousness, and his dialectical understanding of the powerful enunciation of the universal from within the extremities of its negation, and from racism, of course. We seem to find here something which is at least analogous to the pattern of uncertainty of the definition of the normality, albeit in the realm of identities and identifications. The metaphoric designation of the internal stranger as a foreign body or an intruder within the community appears therefore as one that crystallizes the combination of self and other at the heart of any subjective identity, but also allegorizes its permanent potential of racial violence and political creativity. Finally, last example. As for the sexual difference, it is of course the most obvious candidate to the status of a constitutive anthropological difference, but also in a sense the most enigmatic of all. Because I want to keep a direct link with the general problem of the becoming subject of the citizen and the antinomies of civic universalism, I notice here that the various aspects of oppression against women and queer sexualities that we criticize and combat, ranging from domestic exploitation of women's services and reproductive function, to their massive exclusion from the dominant positions in science and politics, to the relegation of feminine sexuality to the so-called passive side, and the localization of sexualities which are not straight or which are queer in the domain of perversion. Certainly, all trace back to an immemorial past, in particular a combination of patriarchic structures and religious regulations of what counts as legitimate sex. In modern times, however, their understanding should undergo a revolution in order to resist the claim of equality that was involved in the declarations of civic universalism and manifested itself immediately in the emergence of feminism, of feminist movement. Let's not forget here that modern feminism is typically a universalistic movement, if there is one, but also that, as civic universalism itself, it was increasingly riddled with internal contradictions, which are like differences within the enunciation of the difference itself. This revolution against the revolution relies, it seems to me, on the typically bourgeois introduction of a supplement of naturality or nature in the representation of the feminine, from which its contradictory relationship to the universal should derive, or a tendency to represent the feminine as the bearer or the residue of nature within universality, qua conventional or institutional construction of the political. But on the background of innumerable and pervasive power structures, not only the domestic structure, but the structure of unequal access to public speech in a language whose semantic and rhetoric are, so to speak, appropriated by the masculine. It also relies on a symbolic double inscription of the masculine, which allows it to function at the same time as generic or neutral, and specific or marked, or as the part and the whole. I call it, therefore, the synecdoche of the masculine, which structures the discourse of civic bourgeois universality until today. It's challenged, of course, permanently. That this supplement of naturalism is resisted in every possible manner by women, but also frequently appropriated and sublimated by them, is no objection to this. On the contrary, at least it seems to me. Now, it being obviously impossible to discuss all the aspects of this structure, this synecdotic structure, or structure of identification of the part with the whole, I want to concentrate on a particular aspect which is also, I believe, extremely revelatory, namely the discussion around the issue of binarism in the understanding of the sexual relation, as it was developed in the psychoanalytic tradition and its critiques. A return to the reading of Freud's theory of bisexuality and the metamorphosis of the Oedipus complex, intimately interdependent, cannot be avoided here. Although it would require a very detailed discussion to remain immune of simplistic evaluations, because it displays the logical constraints of what is ultimately a political structure affecting the very construction of subjectivities. Clearly, Freud's theory of the sexual difference and the relation of the sexes as a libidinal relation, essentially structured in the unconscious, but not confined to the realm of sexuality in the narrow sense, was always already political in its implications and references. It plainly displays the paradoxes of parity, as a certain French feminist discourse would call it. In other terms, the constitution of a human essence, where in permanence 1 is 2 and 2 is 1. Freud's discourse was certainly imbued with numerous prejudices concerning the difference of the masculine and the feminine, which he strives to explain along the lines of the Oedipal scenario, and we know that this led him to continuously return to the issue of the feminine sexuality, which in a strangely colonial metaphor he would call a dark continent, struggling with the idea that feminine desire is entirely dissymmetric from masculine desire, while at the same time maintaining that there is only one libido or one structure of the constitution of the desiring subject, which could only become alternatively realized in a direct or an inverted manner. These are, of course, his terms. Interestingly, Freud continuously and uneasily resisted both the temptation of essential binarism and that of radical pluralism, to which many of his followers, either male or female, oriented themselves. And in a moment I will allude to Judith Butler's position, albeit very summarily. This is not without analogy with what a moment ago I called the liberal position on the issue of the normal and the abnormal. But it is also striking that Freud repudiated equally biological and sociological determinisms and presented the structural combination of choices which confront the subject in the course of his or her acquisition of a definite personality in terms of a superposition, as it were, of two completely open alternatives: a choice of identity between the masculine and the feminine identifications, equally possible for boys and for girls, and a choice of object or modality of love between the homosexual and the heterosexual, none of which is more natural than the other. This structure, both coercive and indeterminate, is precisely what he calls the unconscious. Freud does certainly not deny that there is a normative element here. He does not even want to challenge it as an element of socialization and civilization, but he certainly paves the way for a discussion of the transformations of this element, a critical discussion of the transformations of this element. I find it illuminating to call the redoubled binarisms involving both identity and normality, whereby the antithesis of masculinity and femininity is supported or collected by the antithesis of heterosexuality and homosexuality, and conversely, a symbolic order in the structuralist jargon. But it has to be observed right away that the psychic constraint to which this order subjects the subject, this is typically the play on words that I was indicating at the beginning, is correlated to, and as it were, caught between two elements of radical contingency. One of them is the historical contingency of the type of family and family norms, where the positions of parents, imagined as incarnations of the sexes and providing models of identification, are instituted but also permanently challenged. Families, in fact, are battlefields.